and welcome to the Nintendo Power Retrospectives. I'm Count Zero. We've got another major cover game this issue with Nintendo Power issue number 34 for March of 1992. Again, we've got a really big game this issue to cover, so let's get started. Our cover game this issue is Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I held off on covering this game earlier because I knew this issue was coming. The cover itself is a posed photograph. Now, between the art from back in Fun Club News, the rather clumsily done photograph from way back in issue number 4 with its mannequin Zelda, and this issue here, my order of preference in terms of Zelda covers is the Fun Club News art, followed by this one, and then finally issue number 4. I think what makes this one work so well over the other photographic cover is the design put into the props. The Link costume in the games at this point is fairly basic. However, we've got a lot of detail put into this, the props. We have the detail on the hilt and grip of the Master Sword, and then there's that shield with the crest of the Kingdom of Hyrule that looks absolutely gorgeous, and which they would have had to have had made because the crest made its debut in this game. Speaking of Fun Club News, with this issue of Nintendo Power, we get something that we haven't had since the days of the last few issues of Fun Club News. Overt game advertising, as opposed to the slightly more subtle advertising we'd gotten in terms of guides for games they want you to buy. In this issue, we have an ad for the Super Scope and Super Scope 6. In the letters column this issue, we have notes on what incentives people want to renew their subscription for Nintendo Power. The letters that the magazine published ran towards the absurdly massive shopping sprees, or getting the opportunity to play basketball with Scottie Pippen. Instead, I'm going to focus on some of the more artistic endeavors from Nintendo Power readers. We have some parents who decorated their kids' room with a mural inspired by Super Mario Bros., specifically the water levels. There's also some hot glue figures of Legend of Zelda and Super Mario characters, which, considering this game's cover game, seems apropos. They look pretty good, considering the material. I'm not familiar with the medium of hot glue sculpture, so I don't know how long or how durable the figures are, compared to, say, for example, perler pixel art. Starting off with our NES titles, and in the wake of the Star Wars game for the NES a couple of issues ago, we have our next Star Wars game with Empire Strikes Back. Man, with The Force Awakens coming out this month, I couldn't have planned my schedule out better if I tried. Anyway, focusing on the article and the game, the guide takes you through the ice caves of Hoth and fights with a Wampa and the Imperial probe through to the Battle of Hoth and finally the escape from Echo Base in the wake of, or rather, in advance of the advancing Imperial troops. The guide also provides notes on the Dagobah training levels and teases the Cloud City levels. Empire Strikes Back is a decent game, and it avoids one of the problems I had with the original game, the presence of falling damage. I actually played this game once before for a quality control column, back when I was doing this series as prose articles, so I'm familiar with this game from before. I'd say probably this game's best innovation, one brought on by the plot of the film, is the development of force powers. It let you jump higher, run faster, and hit harder against enemies. There's also a somewhat improved charge jump, where you can hold down to crouch for a while before jumping, allowing you to jump higher, but not necessarily super dramatically higher. Further, the game lets you shoot in 8 directions like Contra, which is another step in the right direction. This game does have a few problems, though. First is it handles resource management poorly. Stock enemies will drop health items to help you refill your health, but they won't drop items to refill your force meter. Further, sometimes your high jumps, whether individually or force augmented, aren't high enough for you to get back to where you fell from or that sort of thing, which means if you take a wrong turn, you can find yourself cut off from significant portions of the level unless you engage in some very prolonged and costly, in terms of force power and health resources, backtracking. Also, I will say, as someone who's not a big fan of ice levels, while I understand that the movie starts in Hoth, giving Hoth ice level physics was, in terms of the sliding, was probably not the best option. Having a mix of normal movement, because hey, you're on snow, and then slippery ice movement might have worked better, but anyway. The game's not terrible by any means, and I've certainly played worse, and I will play worse this issue, but this is definitely a game where I'm not in any hurry to pick up a copy. Next up is a guide for LJN's second adaptation of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. this time for the NES. The guide covers each level in the game and gives a heads up that there is only one continue in this game and that it's an item you can miss. Terminator 2 is a game that has two significant problems. First is the game gives you no continues aside from the aforementioned item, and thus once you run out of lives it's game over and you have to start over from the beginning. The second problem is that the second level of the game requires much more rote memorization than the speeder levels from Battletoads, and in a much less forgiving fashion, requiring you to memorize your route through the level with no warning of where your vehicle needs to be and when. It's very much a pain in the ass, making this game not very fun, and it honestly doesn't represent the film very well at all. In the movie, Arnold basically wades through, for example, the bikers at the truck stop and biker bar with very little hassle, whereas here, it's a significantly difficult opening level. Further, the enemies don't actually drop any power-up items or health refills or anything like that to help make getting through the game more manageable. It feels like a game that is a quarter muncher or designed as a quarter muncher that was never an arcade game in the first place. Next up is Nightshade, a superhero adventure game with action elements. We have maps of the first area of the game, as well as the overworld grid map, along with notes on the peril scenes you encounter when you're defeated. Nightshade is basically an adventure game with combat, and really clunky combat too. I've generally found that adventure games work best either with no combat at all, combat that is more turn-based RPG inspired, in terms of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, or even Wizardry, or combat that is itself a puzzle, like the insult sword fighting from the Monkey Island games. What makes the combat here this issue is that it's meant to be real-time brawler-based, action-style combat, and it's also kind of a mess. Some of the fights in particular are supposed to be puzzle-ish, but not in the sense of insult sword fighting, but the sense that you have to figure out the right strategy for the enemy, just like other boss fights and other NES action games. This still doesn't fix the clunky combat, though, as due to how the combat controls work, and how healing and regeneration from combat works, no matter how well you try it, and how many times you try it, you're still going to get hit, you're still going to take damage, and you're still going to have to deal with that on other screens and other encounters. This leads to the other problem, because health is hard to come by. You can get health by eating food, but this really is the kind of game, due to how it's structured and all the exploration involved, where it would fare better with regenerating health or having you start each combat with full health, so the focus is on surviving each combat instead of health being another resource to manage. This definitely feels like a kind of game I'd prefer to play with a Game Genie code, so I could have full health, instead of having me focus on surviving the combat and having me focus on the crappy combat system. I could focus more on the puzzles and that aspect of the game, which is what I'm getting in for when it comes to puzzle games and adventure games. I want to experience the story. I want to experience the puzzles. I want to work on solving those, rather than getting crappy, brawly combat, which is just not fun. Next is MC Kids, a action platformer that's also an advertising game for McDonald's. We have maps of the first 6 levels of the game. And, well, this is a shockingly well-done platformer. I thought we would have one of two possible scenarios with this game. It would be a crappy cash-in license game on par with the LJN titles that we've covered before, LJN and Ocean. Or because this game was developed and published by Virgin, a British company, this would be a mediocre port of a PC platformer designed for the Amiga or the Spectrum or a similar system like that. This is actually surprisingly well done, with some interesting level mechanics, particularly related to reversing a character's individual gravity. The controls are also very nicely done as well. The main flaw I see with the game is with the arc of the character's jump. The jump arc is very high, but not very wide, without really a way to get a running start for more distance on the jumps. You can still get some distance, but nothing quite like what you'd get with some of the Mario jumps, and Mario is kind of the gold standard for platforming jumps at this point. That said, the levels are designed with this jump arc in mind, so it's not really that much of a liability. In the classified information column, we have some secrets for Legend of the Mystical Ninja. In this issue's installment of the Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past comic, Link discovers a glider that will help him reach the ruins in the middle of the Hyrule Desert in order to get the Pendant of Power. We next, getting into our Game Boy titles, have our second Mega Man title for the Game Boy, Mega Man 2. As with the previous game, this goes through 2 sets of 4 Robot Masters. We have a recommended order of Clash Man, Metal Man, Wood Man, and Air Man for the first set, and Needle Man, Magnet Man, Hard Man, and Top Man for the second set. We also have maps for the first quartet of Robot Masters. Unfortunately, Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy has the same problem that Dr. Wily's Revenge had. The developers simply failed to figure out how to adequately manage having very character-filled sprites on screen that were also big enough to give levels and characters the amount of, well, character that we're accustomed to having in a Mega Man game. And the screen real estate available on the Game Boy, and having the level design reflect those limitations. So, this led to situations where, for example, the balance just doesn't work. A great example is the moving platforms in the Crash Man stage. In the NES version, you could jump over enemies as they spawn, whenever they do hazards like this, where you have moving platforms and enemies that spawn in. If they weren't in a position where you couldn't shoot them, or rather where you could not shoot them, you could jump over them, and then when they got in a position where you could shoot them, you could just shoot them. This takes skill to do for the jumping and adjusting your position to shoot at enemies as they approach, but it was certainly possible, allowing you to get to this portion of the stage potentially without being hit. Here, though, the track is too confined, the screen is too small, and all the sprites are too big, so you can't get through this screen without getting hit at least once. Continuing with our Game Boy titles, we have Tiny Toon Adventures for the Game Boy. We have maps for the first 2 stages, and notes for the 3rd and 4th stages. My primary complaint with the NES Tiny Toons game is that they couldn't reconcile their physics, which had a slippery, out-of-control feel that fit with the tone of comedy cartoon movement, with the level design for the game. Well, Tiny Toons for the Game Boy doesn't have this problem. The slippery physics are still here, but the game feels more like they designed the levels with those physics in mind. Consequently, we have levels designed with large, fairly detailed sprites, where you have enough advance notice of where you need to go, in terms of camera perspective, to plan your movements without getting too complex when it comes to the jumping required. However, this game introduces a new problem: resource management. You are switching between 3 characters: Buster Bunny, Hampton the Pig, and Plucky Duck, each with a fruit they can throw as enemies as an attack, in addition to jumping on them. The problem being that you have limited throw ammunition, and each weapon has a different arc. Plucky's pineapples rebound off the level geometry, Buster's carrots fly in a straight arc going through level geometry, and Hampton's watermelons roll across the ground like bowling balls. So, different weapons are more useful in different situations. It almost feels like it would have been better to keep the different shot types and then have them have a shared ammo pool. Because instead, the way it works is different boxes or whatever will drop different ammo for different weapons, and hopefully you get the ammo that you need for the attacks that you need to use for the level environments that you're working with. It doesn't work great, but the game is still otherwise fairly enjoyable. And is definitely superior to the last Tiny Toons game.